Matt, have you ever wanted to take something from a movie or from a book and put it into your RPG game?
This is a trick question because, I feel like we've done at least 3 videos where we've talked about that. But in this video, we're specifically talking about horror. Horror classics. And we're talking about books, we're talking about movies, we're talking about any source of horror material because it's October, Justin. It's your it's Christmas for Justin.
So stay tuned for the rest of the video.
So the question is, what aspects of stories, whether they're movies or books or whatever, make good fodder for adaptations?
Yes, there are a lot of really good things out there that we can take and cram into our RPGs to make them spooky and try to not necessarily make it a trope, but use that as a boilerplate, as you say, to build a foundation for your game.
Yeah, look, there's so many good horror materials out there. I mean, there's movies that we love, books that we love, things that have literally become classics and sort of foundational in pop culture, right? So how do we borrow the stuff that's good and make the most of it in a game setting? So one of the things that you had talked about was sort of presenting things out of order and stories within stories kind of thing.
Yeah, I was specifically talking, how I brought it up was I was talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula, but we also got into talking about Pulp Fiction.
Yes, and a bunch of other material. One of the most effective ways to sort of deliver exposition or backstory is to do a little vignette within a story. And this works really, really well in a game.
Yeah, I like the found footage aspect of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and there's other stories that do it too. That's just like the big horror one that I can think of. But
yeah, diaries. You find somebody's diary and you read a narrative of a piece of action that took place when you weren't present, but you're fed that information in the first person by the account of the person who was there. So that works really, really well.
And it's kind of terrifying as you try to piece them together in your own head because you don't get all the answers at once.
Especially if they come out of order.
Yes.
I mean, that is kind of how you play with this and how the idea first came about when we were talking about it is you can give people disjointed pieces of the puzzle and it becomes their job to piece it together and make sense of it. So it's a challenge for them. It's hard to follow, and their imagination will fill in the blanks. And they'll spook themselves out trying to figure out the message that you've given to them in bits and pieces.
And it's not necessarily hard to do this because you can do it with box text and different ways of giving exposition without like lore dumps all at once. Giving fun ways to show the story where the players don't have as much impact on it, but still learn about it.
Yeah, well, and I guess what we're talking about here is ways to do box text that doesn't feel like box text, right? And so, because the thing about a horror game is it's all about ambiance, it's all about the tone, sort of maintaining the illusion and the vibe of being scared and spooky and creeped out. So, sort of keeping that feeling in place is important. And when you have to break the tension to read a piece of box text, that can kind of, get people out of the mood of the game. So if you can work ways to get that exposition into your game that maintains that vibe, I think it's really good. And this sort of vignettes or diaries or cut scenes, all of those types of things they're a great way to do that, and you can put them in any order you want.
So what do you think are the core pillars that we can take from print and video movies and kind of throw into our games to help support that?
Okay, my first foremost, it's stories that incorporate containment or confinement, like enclosed spaces. I think that's key. You can do a horror story without that, but it gets dramatically easier if you've got your players locked in with whatever you're trying to scare them with. They can't get out. They can't escape, and they're forced to confront.
Sounds like your favorite movie, The Thing.
Yes. Yeah. Look, The Thing, Alien. These stories are built around what is essentially a modified dungeon crawl, right? You lock them in.
Yep.
So they can't escape. They have to confront the big bad. And the only way to save themselves is to confront the worst thing they could confront. So that there's terror baked into that story. Yeah. So
Alien is just a dungeon crawl in space.
Yes, absolutely. There's no question that's exactly what it is.
What I'm finding here is that a lot of these stories, that the pillars that we want to add to our RPGs, is giving a lot of build up and tension with mystery and suspense.
Yeah, look, the unknown is always more terrifying than the known, right? Again, leveraging, let your players do the heavy lifting. Let their imagination scare them.
Yeah.
What you don't tell them, they will fill in. So give them enough clues to build a terrifying story to creep themselves out, and then you don't have to work so hard to keep them on that adrenaline spike of being scared. They'll do it to themselves. And that all kind of ties into the next sort of thing, which is psychological horror, the mystery, suspense, tension, slow burn kind of horror. I think always works better in a gaming environment, putting aside personal preferences. Like, you don't care for the body horror stuff, which I tend to agree with you, although I'm not quite as sensitive to it as you are. But I will say that I don't think that it's particularly effective in a game setting, regardless of personal tastes. And here's why. Body horror is visual in nature, right? It hangs on visual imagery. So it's really hard to describe verbally those images effectively without like really specific visual aids.
Good.
And so like in an RPG where you're doing most of your image creation through words, maybe with the help of some visual aids and whatever, but it's primarily words and descriptions, trying to picture a grisly visual image of that sort, it's just hard to give it the punch that it would need in order to be effective as horror.
Yeah.
And slasher horror, I think the problem with it using slasher genre as your gaming sort of foundation is it's the antithesis of the gaming mentality for players. Okay, it requires your PCs to encounter the big bad early enough and then run from him for the rest of the story, which we know players, they're just not wired to do that.
Yeah.
Like, if you confront your players with a monster, they're going to fight him.
Yep.
They are going to fight him.
Whether they're level 1 or level 20, they're still going to try to fight it. We were discussing earlier that it's easier for me, and it's easier for you too, as a game master, to build a story from something with a very large backstory and lore. A lot of the heavy lifting was done not only by Lovecraft, but I really like his disciples more.
Yeah.
And why I like it so much is because, you might know what Amigo is in your games, but just reskinning it with a different stat block to kind of twist what your players prey on their expectations. I
think there's two really good points that you're making there. Number one, the rich body of backstory material that Lovecraft and the whole genre that he created and his disciples and so forth, there's just such a large body of work, right?
Yeah.
That it's a bottomless well of good, juicy stuff to draw from.
Yep.
So that's one big advantage. The second big advantage is, like you say, because there's such a large body of work, and some of it is reasonably well known, although I would argue not as well known as some of other sort of giant horror concepts, the Draculas, the Frankensteins, that kind of stuff. But still, it's out there, and people may know it. But you can use that against them. You can use their assumptions against them. They think they know the monster, and they think they know how to defeat him. So you just let them go ahead and make those assumptions, and you flip it on them, and they're extra terrified and extra frustrated when they find out that the thing they thought was guaranteed true isn't.
Yeah.
So it's a great tool to be able to sort of use people's preconceived notions against them.
Exactly.
Regardless of where you pull your material from, one thing that I think is very important is to keep in mind the scope of the material. I think in order to keep it fun and exciting and accessible and relatable to your gaming audience, you need to work with the small stuff first.
Okay.
Right? The thing about Lovecraft in particular, right? He's got stories, and his disciples have stories about the small monsters.
Mm-hmm.
They're mook level, or just a bit above mook level.
Yep.
Right? And that can be very creepy and set ambiance, and there can be mystery
Read the rats in
associated.
the walls. That's
Yeah.
literally rats.
But then he's got these unfathomably huge, ancient, mind-bendingly large monster evil things. And it's almost impossible to work that into a game except as backstory.
Yeah.
Right? As motivation for a smaller character to do what he's doing is that he's trying to curry favor with some old one, right? And that works. That makes sense for the mythology and the methodology of a game. But you don't want Yog-Sothoth to come like popping out at the end of your game. It's just not going to work. Like, there's no stat block that you can do for that. You had asked me about what I like. Movies.
Right.
We talked about The Thing. We talked about Alien. There's a series of sort of pulpy horror authors. They go by Preston and Child, Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. They do some kind of straddling the line between supernatural and scientific explanations for things. And they got a gazillion books. They made one into a movie that I know of, Relic, which is kind of a cool containment horror monster movie. But they have a bunch of others that I borrow from, and that they're great.
Okay.
Classics like The Fog and the Mist is good ambiance horror. You even talked about Jurassic Park as being potentially material for that. So yeah, there's a lot of good movies. And then maybe the explosion of zombie films, like in television shows, Walking Dead, Night of the Living Dead, 28 Days Later, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a gazillion. So
Fast zombies or slow zombies?
you can do both well. I think for tension, slow zombies. For actual challenge for the PCs, fast zombies actually make more sense. Yeah, so I mean, that's how to borrow, right? That's what to borrow from. That's what to look for when you're borrowing.
Thank you guys very much for watching.
Yeah, he lost me already.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Please do. And stay tuned, because it's just the beginning of October, and we're going to be dishing up more of this stuff as we go.
Game on.
Game on, guys. Thank you.